Today, let's take our time and relax with some spooky stories and the sounds of rain. If you need something to fall asleep to, something to scare you, something to help you chill, then I've got you covered. Before we begin, like and share this video if you want to support the show. Send us your scary stories to narrate at darkstories.org. Now, let's begin. The Screaming Man from Batwill 85. This event happened to me on April of 2017 in Caracas. My then girlfriend, now wife, and I had been staying at my mother-in-law's apartment for a few weeks. My mother's apartment, where we actually lived, was being remodeled at the time. For some context, the apartment where we were staying is located on the 4th floor of a relatively small 10-floor building, which was positioned right in front of the city's main highway. I say small because there are very tall buildings in my city, which were as tall as 40 to 50 floors, and the people that lived in these buildings suffered greatly when the elevators didn't work. Imagine going up and down the stairs for 50 or 60 floors. That's a lot of exercise for one day. So there were a lot of things I had to get used to in that place. Chief among them was hearing the sounds of cars, trucks, flat tires, damaged exhaust pipes, and the occasional sound of shots being fired from the poor neighborhood that was close to my girlfriend's home, which could be heard during the day and night. In contrast, my mother's neighborhood was usually quite quiet, especially at night. So I had to change my sleeping habits a bit. I usually went to bed quite late at night, usually around 1 a.m. This apartment was smaller than my apartment, and it was located on a different side of the city. But I didn't care about those things, as long as I could get a good night's sleep next to my wife, since I suffered from insomnia. The first time I came to my wife's apartment, I noticed that there was a small hill with a huge tree. Some medium to small-sized plants, bushes, and patches of grass, which were right next to the highway. This seemed a little creepy to me at night. In that hill, I noticed that there was a small makeshift aluminum shack. It was a little odd. I thought to myself, well, that's weird. Maybe some hobo or homeless person lives there. And if they do, they must be crazy to be living right there. On the first 2 nights I stayed there, even though I could hear the loud sounds of the highway, it took me a while to fall asleep. Fortunately, everything was okay, and I was able to get a good night's rest on those 2 days. But on the 3rd night, as much as I wanted it to be exactly the same, it was quite different than the first couple of nights. I remember it was late at night, probably midnight or later. I was almost sound asleep, listening to scary stories on my cell phone to fall asleep to, just like I always did, however crazy that might sound. Suddenly, I was startled by the ear-piercing screams of some man or woman hurling a long string of curses at someone. This woke me right away and scared the bejesus out of me at the same time. What was that? I shook my wife's shoulder and asked, "Honey, did you hear that?" She was mostly still asleep, so she responded, "Hear what? It was nothing, go to sleep." However, I soon heard the cursing again. I decided to go investigate. I got up from bed, rubbed my eyes, then put on my slippers. I walked slowly and quietly out of the bedroom toward the balcony. From there, I could clearly see the highway and the small hill next to it. The sound of cursing could still be heard, but more clearly now. It sounded like the cries of a deranged man. I thought to myself, maybe I was right. There is indeed a homeless person living in that metal hut. I was standing there in my sleeping clothes, being slippers and boxers. I was staring down at that hill. I could see the metal hut on the first day I slept in my wife's apartment. Weirdly enough, I was able to see a small campfire and a barefoot man coming out of the shack. He had long, disheveled hair, and a long bushy beard. He was shirtless and wearing torn pants that were almost destroyed. He came out of the small shack smoking a cigarette, or God only knows what else it might have been. He was standing on that hill in the dark, screaming his lungs out and cursing a lot for some reason, while he stared toward the highway. I thought that this man must have been crazy, out of his mind on some sort of substance, yelling at passing cars or people or dogs that were all the way on the other side of the highway. This made me feel unsettled. I asked myself, what is he even saying? And isn't he cold out there? Because of this racket, there were some neighborhood dogs barking in the man's direction. I thought it was really strange for someone to scream so much, especially this late at night. Unfortunately for me, my mother-in-law was a night owl, and usually slept in the living room. She turned on the kitchen lights out of the blue to get some water, then went back to sleep, which reflected a little bit toward the balcony. I turned my head and was a little blinded by the glare of light, but at the same time, I was scared that the man would see me staring at him. In that moment, I hid, crouched below the window, so the man could not see me. I was horrified when I saw that the man walked to the fire and angrily put the fire out with his bare feet. He swung his head around from the highway to look at the outer wall of the building, all the while cursing out loud still. Dude's having a bad trip, I thought. Suddenly, this crazy guy looked up at the building wall. He walked until he was right in front of it, and he yelled,
"I can't take it anymore. The voices are driving me crazy."
He then began to repeatedly bash his head into the wall until his head was covered in red. He yelled then,
"Get out of my head!"
The sound was terrifying, the wet thuds against the wall as he beat his head against it. When he was done, he touched his head with his right hand, then finding some that dripped on his chest, began to wipe at it. Smeared in blood, he looked crazier than ever. Suddenly, the guy looked right at me. We were now staring at each other when he yelled,
"What do you want? Mind your business."
I was scared to death. I threw myself to the balcony's ceramic floor, wincing at how cold it was, and I stayed there for a while. I thought to myself, out of sight, out of mind, right? The crazy man kept screaming curses at me now. I decided that that was enough for me. I quietly crouched back to bed, feeling terrible about what I saw, and I could not sleep anymore that night. After all, the only things I could hear were my mother-in-law's snores and the man's violent screams. The following day, I felt extremely tired. I wasn't able to rest the night before. I told my wife about what happened. She told me, yeah, at some point you get used to that crazy man and his screams. But she didn't believe me when I said that the guy bashed his brains into the wall, nearly killing himself. So it dawned on me. Should I call the cops if he does it again? I wondered, but I decided against it. My country's police are basically useless, so I still don't know what to do about this crazy screaming man. His awful cries still give me nightmares, but I'll know better than to look out over the balcony at night again. My mom works in a haunted school. From NEStormTrooper. I'm a 22-year-old girl, and my mom is in her late 50s. She's been working at this school for 24 years. It's a large kindergarten through 8th grade school with about 700 students total. As for me, I've always been into creepy stories and the paranormal, watching shows like Ghost Adventures as a child. but I was not prepared to experience something like this myself. It was a cold New England winter night, around 11 p.m. Snow was already blanketing the ground. Being the maintenance manager, my mom and her facilities crew would have to go to the school, clean up all the snow, as well as check the building's heating system. The building is very big. It would take a while to finish everything. So my mom asked if I'd like to come along and help with checking the heat. I agreed, as I was bored to death. There was a good few inches of snow on the ground. I offered to start checking the heat while Mom and the boys cleared up the snow outside. I took the infrared thermometer with me, which is basically a thermometer gun, and I went inside to start checking the boilers and classrooms. I was the only person that wasn't inside the building at the time. I started at the first floor boiler room, where it was not unusual to hear clicks and taps. Then I began checking the first floor classrooms. I pointed my thermometer into the kindergarten hallway. 74 degrees. As I was entering one of the kindergarten classrooms, I suddenly began to feel like I was being watched. Then, all the lights in the building seemed to go off, all at once. My first thought was that the storm knocked out the power. I went back to the boiler room to grab a large flashlight so I could continue checking the classrooms. Then I returned to the kindergarten hallway. The air was ice cold. It wasn't this way before when I went for the flashlight. I started to hear breathing, too. I thought maybe one of the boys came back into the building. I called out his name, but there was no answer. I pointed my thermometer gun around the hallway. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees. I then noticed that the breathing I heard had stopped, as did everything else. No wind or sound of the snowblowers coming from outside. Panicking, I started toward the lobby, to the exit, but as soon as I made it to the small staircase, I stopped. The lobby was so dark, I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. But then, I felt a cold hand on my back. I nearly passed out right there, as I also heard the inaudible whispering again. I lost it. I screamed bloody murder and began sprinting towards the front doors. As soon as I pushed the doors open, everything was normal again, as if someone had flipped a switch. I ran through the blowing snow, finding one of the boys, and asked if he had seen the power go out. He looked at me like I had 4 heads. I found my mom and told her what happened. She then told me that the school was purportedly haunted. She then proceeded to tell me that nobody knows exactly why the school is that way, but we do know that below lies an ancient Indian burial ground. Needless to say, I'll never do another night shift with my mom. I'll stick to TV shows and stories. Ghostly Torso, from Luis R. A while back, my mom told me about an encounter she had as a kid, along with her sister, on the old farm in rural Mexico. To begin, my mom's dad was shot and died right in front of her by their neighbor when she was 12, over an unknown reason. A couple of days after that, they decided to vandalize the neighbor's house to get back at them. Maybe not the best idea, but can you blame them? The sun was about to set, so they headed out. They didn't have electricity in the area at the time. It was that rural and secluded. Add on top of that, the legends they had been told since they were young, like La Llorona and the horse-faced lady, and it makes for a very creepy setting. Supposedly even, my uncle actually saw the horse-faced lady himself. The whole area is full of hills and trails leading to other houses. Anyway, they walked to the man's house and began messing around with stuff, breaking windows and the mailbox. I don't remember too much of the details, but as the sun set, they noticed something walking down the trail. My mom called her sister over and showed her. The two of them then went to get a better look at the trail, and to their dismay, they noticed something disturbing. There was a man coming up the trail, but it wasn't a normal man. It was just a torso with no head, walking along the trail, getting closer. My mom, scared out of her mind, just stood there in fear before finally grabbing her sister and telling her to run. They ran back to the house as fast as they could. No one was home at the time, so they locked themselves in, crying together. She says the feeling of the room was heavy at the time. There was an eeriness to it, a feeling of dread, waiting in the dark with no light to see what happened. She began to cry out for her dad to help them, pleading for this thing not to get them. She then felt something in the room with her, but this feeling wasn't scary. It was comforting. When they had the courage to glance back out to the trail again, the torso man was gone, and they were safe. When I was 16, I visited the area. It was as creepy as I thought it would be. Nothing for miles save a little village down the mountain. My mother has never gone back to her childhood home. She says there are too many bad memories. She believes that it was karma for being stupid kids, and that thing came after them, and that she was lucky that perhaps the spirit of her father protected her that night. Then again, who knows what they saw? But I believe her. Work encounter from Alice May, 18. This happened back in late November 2019. That's a day I'll probably never forget. I work in a small souvenir shop in Southern California. It's set up in two parts, the first being the front of the store that has the only door, and the second being the back room. The register for the shop is towards the back of the first room, and there is a counter where I stand and a small work area behind me that is separate from the rest of the store. It's like our own little corner where we work on different projects and keep an eye on security cameras in the back room, as well as any other blind spot in the store. The owner usually can't afford to keep more than one person working, but as it was the busiest time of the year for us, she had just hired the daughter of an old family friend named Izzy. She had only just turned 18 at the time. I got along with her very well, despite the age difference being nearly a decade. To this day, I was both grateful and terrified that I had Izzy working with me that day. I mean, I feared for her, but that fear made me think rationally, and it probably may have turned out very different if it weren't for her presence there that day. It was pouring rain that weekend. There weren't too many people in the shop that day, minus a few couples, tourists, and an occasional person wishing to get out of the unusual rainy day. It was early afternoon, but it seemed later due to the storm overhead. I was checking out a customer at the counter, while Izzy was in the work area behind me. We were casually talking, when all of a sudden we heard someone scream, "Call 911! The lady and I froze. Izzy looked toward the front door, startled. I asked Izzy to finish the sale for me as I went towards the front door to see what was going on. No one was in sight, and I only caught a glimpse of someone entering a store across the street through the heavy rain. I went back over and asked the woman if she would be okay going back to her car. She smiled, saying that her husband was in the back room and waiting for her to finish her shopping. Izzy and I bid the couple a good rest of their day before moving on with our project. The shop phone rang less than a minute later, and I answered. A woman, sounding almost panicked, was on the other line. The conversation went as followed.
Hi,
She came into my shop a few minutes ago. She seemed like she was on something. I sent her away, and it looked like she went towards your shop. If she gets violent, call the cops immediately. Do you understand? You know that feeling you get when you're being watched? I felt that then. I turned around to see the very same woman that the caller had warned me about. I told the caller that I had to go, so I hung up. This young woman was about my age, maybe in her late 20s, with dark hair, and was soaking wet, dripping on the floor. She stood about 5'8", which is about a couple inches shorter than me. She stared at me with large, dark, unblinking eyes that seemed to be bloodshot, and her breathing was shallow and quick. I'd been around people who were either mentally ill or had done drugs all my life. I could tell right away that this young woman was obviously drugged out, and perhaps even suffered from a type of paranoia or schizophrenia. My first reaction with people like that isn't usually to be aggressive, especially with schizophrenic or drug-crazed people. They can be unpredictable. I turned to Izzy as she got up, and I held out my arm, telling her to stay behind the counter in the work area, where it was safer. I went around the counter to block this woman from Izzy just in case. As I said, my first reaction was not to be aggressive, but I am very protective. I can stay calm in the face of potential danger. "Can I help you, ma'am?" I asked. The woman looked down for a moment and muttered something low and fast before looking back up to me.
Can you call the cops? I don't want to sleep in the rain tonight.
Okay, ma'am. I'll do that right now. Let me get the shop phone and I'll call them. Please stand there for a minute while I call, okay? She didn't look at me and only nodded. She looked away, her rigid stance not faltering at all. I'd seen similar body language with my brother before, just before he would break something or slam his fist into a wall. I turned to Izzy, who sat at the desk. I told her I was going to call the cops, and for her to be ready to call the owner if things get more tense. She nodded. I could tell she was on edge too, as she looked behind me at the woman. I turned back around to keep an eye on the woman. She said,
Just tell them I'm threatening you and breaking a bunch of crap.
She said, and I nodded, looking up at her and meeting her wide, fiery eyes.
Because I will if they don't come here.
I remember feeling like I was going to be sick as I called 911. They answered on the third ring, asking for the location. I told them the address, and that there was a woman in the store threatening violence. That's all I got out before the operator said, "I'm sorry, I'll call you back in a few minutes, ma'am." And then she hung up on me. The police operator hung up on me. I stood frozen for a few minutes in complete disbelief and unyielding anger.
Did you call them?
The woman demanded. I, in complete shock, unthinkingly said, "They hung up on me." The woman's eyes somehow grew wider with rage, and she slammed her hand on one of the metal shelves.
Do I need to break everything in this freaking store for them to come here?
Both Izzy and I said no very sternly, and she jerked her head towards Izzy, who now stood behind the counter. I held out my hands in a calming manner toward the woman, trying my best to keep her as docile as I could, treating her like she was an angry and aggressive, wounded dog. I reassured her that that was not necessary and that I would just call downtown security instead. I mean, they were technically police officers. I told her that they would figure it out and take her someplace to sleep out of the rain for the night. She nodded again, and I reached for my phone as well as a cracker pack from my bag. I offered her the snack, reaching out to place it on a shelf. She began to eat the food, shaking and looking around at everything with a frightened expression, like a small child who woke from a nightmare and was on the verge of tears. It was then that the police called me back. I told them the address and everything that was going on, including the threats of violence. The officer asked me to ask the woman her name, and I asked her.
Carolyn,
She said, eating the crackers with wide, teary eyes. I told the officer, and she asked me to ask the woman her last name. When I did, the woman, who had been standing there in a cowering and shaky stance, suddenly stopped completely. Her body had frozen like a statue, unnervingly so, before turning her head slowly up to look at me, with the most hate-filled, serial killer-like eyes I'd ever seen on a person in my life. My breath froze, and I held out my hand in a calming and defensive way. "It's okay," I said lowly, trying to sound as reassuring as I could. "It's okay. You don't need to tell me." I told the officer on the phone that she did not want to answer the question, and what she told me over the phone infuriates me to this day. "We're very busy right now and short-staffed. We can't do anything until she actually does something violent. Call us back when she does." And then they hung up. I was so enraged as I then called the downtown security. Again, I repeated the same request, explained that I feared for myself and the customers and my young coworker. They finally told me that there was a guard that was only a minute or two away, and they would signal him to go by and pick her up. I said thank you, then hung up. As if to top it off, an older and smaller man came up to the counter from the back room and asked if he could see something in one of our cases. I told him in a forced, kind voice that I would be happy to help him in a few minutes, but he'd have to wait. He must have read my expression because he stopped, looked over at the crazed woman, whose eyes did not leave me the entire time. Then he stepped back into the other room, saying, take all the time you need." The security officer came in a minute later, and I felt relief wash over me as he talked to the woman and led her away outside. It was only then that I began trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. Izzy stepped towards me, patting me on the back. The older man came back into the front room with his young granddaughter. He and Izzy told me that I handled the situation well, and the man even commented saying that he had no idea that anything was wrong because I'd been so calm. The police called me back about 20 minutes later, asking if the woman was still there, and angrily I told them that she was not, no thanks to them, and that it was good to know that I could rely on security guards more than police. I remember telling them that next time they shouldn't hang up on a 911 call if the person is being threatened, or say they won't do anything unless someone is already hurt. I told them to take their jobs more seriously. I relayed the information where they could find the security guard that took the woman away, and I hung up. I heard the next day from the owner that the woman had been arrested for drug use, and apparently she had a concealed firearm on her. She thanked me for being so level-headed during it all, but the thing is, I had no idea she had a gun, and I don't know if the woman would have used it on us, but I'm glad it didn't come to that. As for this woman, this Carolyn, I pray that you get the help you need, and I hope we never meet again. Man with the Hat, from Kysha. I'm 22 years old and live in Holland. I always had a thing with the paranormal. Nothing really scared me ever since I was young, but when I hit puberty, I began to get really bad dreams. Night terror, sleep paralysis. I always saw shadowy figures around my bed, staring at me, grabbing me from every side, all the while I couldn't move. And after it feels like forever, I would snap out of it. But that's not even the worst of it. After some time, things began to calm down. No more shadow people, some nightmares, but not that bad. A couple of years later, I saw the shadow people again, but not when I was sleeping. This time around, I would be wide awake, lying in bed with my now ex-boyfriend. We both lived in my mom's house. I saw someone in the corner of the room. I remember blinking, and it was then standing there beside me, crouched over. I nearly soiled myself, but was petrified. But none of that compares to the time when I saw the man with the hat. In my old house, my room was in the middle when you walked upstairs. Next to my room was my mom's walk-in closet. I saw him there, standing there every night for about 8 months. I was so scared of him. I felt as if he was pure evil. I still saw other shadowy figures from time to time, but he was the only one with the hat. Thankfully, eventually we moved out. No more shadow people or man in the hat. A new chapter in my life, but I had a rough time. A lot of stress from a new job and a new school. That led to depression, and I got addicted to some substances. One night after drinking at my friend's house, never drink and drive, people, I drove home around 4 in the morning. I was 2 blocks away from my house, and I was driving 20 kilometers an hour. On the sidewalk, I saw a man with a bike in his hand. He had a big hat on. For a second, I wasn't thinking much of him until I saw his face. It was all twisted and wrong. It scared me so bad I sped home and got inside quick. It was the man in the hat, the one that I'd seen every day in the old house. I slept with my mom that night. Since then, I've begun to love life again. I'm getting help for my problems. I was vulnerable, and that's why he came back, I think. I don't know what he wanted, but I never want to see him again. The spirit that I encountered in the Yukon, from Timid Deer. I am of First Nations descent, specifically Cree and Saulteaux. I'm from southern Saskatchewan, but this story takes place up north in the Yukon Territory in the summer of 2014. I was 14 years old, and I was participating in a camp for cadets. That was when I first heard its voice. We had set up camp on a small island in the middle of a large lake. At the time, I didn't have that much belief in spirits of any kind. I was skeptical of the paranormal in a way. This took place at night. Then again, daylight didn't change much that far up north. I woke up in the middle of the night on my own. It was during the hour of darkness. I felt like I needed to go to the washroom. But I began to hear whispering coming from the woods. The part where we were told not to go. Other than the whispering, nothing else happened, which, compared to what happened 2 days later, was really nothing. While bicycling, a male cadet and I almost encountered a bear, but that wasn't just it. When I began to ride back with the small group we were with, I heard the whispering again while alone. It sounded like it was calling out to me. I brushed it off as myself just being jumpy after the bear encounter. Nothing really happened until a small group of cadets, myself included, got lost in the woods later that day. The larger group went too far ahead and forgot all about us. While we were walking and bicycling deeper into this random trail that we chose to go down for some reason, it got really quiet. Not even the birds were chirping or singing. There was only the sound of our breathing and the ground crunching underneath our footsteps and bikes. I had a sense of doom all of a sudden. It never left, despite it not being close to the hour of darkness. The trees and skies seemed to get darker and darker, until it looked like we were in the late afternoon back down south. When we stopped to drink water and catch our breath, I heard the whispering again. It was closer now. "Timid, it said to me. It was deep off the trail. I started to tear up immediately, now despair and sadness replacing that sense of doom. That's because it spoke in my Mo-Shom's voice. Quick note, Mo-Shom may be referring to the experiencer's grandparent. Back to the story. I knew it wasn't Mo-Shom because he died 4 years ago. I had a deep, dark feeling of what it was. I'd heard the stories of certain spirits, but given the time of year, I can't speak their name. But I feared that's what it was, one of these spirits. The voice called again, but everyone else was talking to each other, not paying attention to their surroundings. I looked into the direction of the voice, and I soon saw something in the bushes. I can best describe it as a tall and frail-looking person with long, knotted hair. Protruding from its head were either long sticks or antlers. Then there were those eyes. They glowed a deep golden glow. Despite its frail appearance, just looking at it, I knew that it could hurt me. It could kill me if it really wanted to. It spoke again.
Come here, timid. I need your help right now.
I started to cry. I felt like it wanted to lure me away from the group and closer to it, using my Mo-Shom's voice as a weapon. I begged my fellow cadets to leave, that we needed to leave the area immediately. I didn't want to tell them what I saw, or even look at it. I didn't want the others to see it. They agreed and mounted their bikes. I was the last to get on mine, because I stayed behind for a moment, unwrapping an energy bar and throwing it towards the creature as some sort of desperate offering. I guess I felt I had to give it something to appease it in some way, a request from me to not follow us. Then I turned and rode away. Riding was difficult at first, due to the tears blurring my vision, but somehow we managed to get away. The group believed I was upset being separated from my sister. I never truly told anyone why I freaked out, not even my sister. They all would have thought that I was crazy, but luckily I never encountered it again. I felt like I was extremely lucky that I was with the group at the time. I probably should have at the very least went to an elder as soon as possible. If it was truly one of them, I'm not entirely sure. It could have easily been some sort of mentally unstable person too. But I believe that this was one of the spirits that I mentioned before, and I was incredibly lucky that it was in a good mood. I'm not even sure if I angered it or not by giving it that energy bar. I learned that day that there are such things as cryptids. Perhaps that's what it could count as. All legends come from some sort of truth. I fear that it may have followed me from Saskatchewan to the Yukon. You never know what spirits will do or how they work. If I had any advice to give, it would be to stay in your group, stay close to them, stay together, and keep an eye out for one another. Listen to your superiors and be aware of your surroundings, and if the world around you goes quiet, pay extra attention. If you believe you've encountered one of these beings, do your best not to anger or provoke it, especially if they look as though they may be weak or frail or even harmless, because that's just the opposite. Regardless of size, there's a reason these things are feared. Well, that brings us to the end of this Darkness Prevails episode, but I hope you enjoyed it. More scary stories are coming soon, so stay tuned. If you want to support the show, like and share this episode somewhere, and send us your scary experiences at darkstories.org. If you want to leave a suggestion for a future episode, leave it below in the comments, and be sure to check out those links in the description. Until next time, here are the credits to my patrons who have donated or continue to donate. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.